A single whisper cuts through the dark. Not every king dies in honor. Some drown in their own glory. Among all the dazzling stories in Scripture, none hides a quieter tragedy. And none tells of a mind that destroyed itself faster than Solomon, born from scandal, chosen by grace, and swallowed at the end by the very brilliance that once made the world tremble. You are standing at the gates of ancient Jerusalem. The city murmurs like a veiled confession, chisels carving temple stone priests, chanting in half-light foreign envoys padding through royal halls, until the sound shifts. Soft at first, then unmistakable, the whisper of strange altars rising on the Mount of Olives, altars built by the king who once dedicated the glory of heaven. He had 1,000 women but somehow lost himself. This is not the fairy tale of a wise king with a golden crown. This is the descent of a man who touched the peak of divine favor only to walk willingly into the shadows he created. You will see the failed coup that almost drowned a nation, the cold calculations of royal politics, the night when heaven asked a young king, "Tell me what you desire," the wisdom that shook empires, the sins that shattered a kingdom, and the question that still haunts history: did Solomon ever return to the God who raised him? Step now into the realm where history breathes through the dim glow of prophecy, where stories are not told but unearthed, where every fragment of Scripture is a doorway, and every doorway leads deeper into the mystery of the human heart. Welcome to a journey for those who seek more than answers, a journey for those who dare to watch the dust of centuries rise again. And it all begins with a succession crisis dripping on the edge of blood. The final days of King David felt like the last embers of a fading fire. His palace, once a storm of decisions and declarations, had grown quieter, dimmer, as if waiting for a breath that would never return. Outside its walls, courtiers whispered in the corridors, captains exchanged uneasy glances, and the entire kingdom sensed a dangerous vacuum opening at the heart of Israel's throne. And into that vacuum stepped Adonijah, the son of Haggith, handsome, ambitious, and born into old royal privilege. Adonijah watched his father weaken and saw his chance. With David bedridden and the nation suspended between breath and silence, Adonijah proclaimed himself king. Not tomorrow, not after council, but now. A coronation launched in secret, fueled by allies who longed for influence and carried out under the assumption that the old lion could no longer rise. It shocked the kingdom like the crack of a lightning bolt over Jerusalem. While David was still alive, another man wore his crown. Adonijah gathered chariots, horsemen, soldiers. He prepared a banquet fit for triumph, inviting powerful men who had drifted away from David's weakening circle. The sound of music and celebration echoed in the outskirts, carried on the wind like a premature victory song. In his mind, the throne was already his, the kingdom already conquered. But deep within the palace, another story was unfolding. Bathsheba, mother of Solomon, moved with the poise of a woman who understood the cost of silence. She had learned long ago that history rewards the brave and crushes the passive. Walking through the dim corridors toward David's chamber, she carried not only the weight of a mother's fear, but also the memory of a promise. A divine thread tied to her son's destiny. Nathan the prophet accompanied her. Nathan, who had rebuked kings, confronted sin, and witnessed the rise and fall of human hearts. He knew the stakes. He knew Adonijah's ascent was not merely political. It threatened the covenant itself. If Solomon did not sit on the throne, the future of Israel and the promise God had spoken through David would be violently rerouted. Their footsteps toward David's chamber felt like crossing the threshold between two worlds, one collapsing, one struggling to be born. They found David fragile, his breath shallow, his eyes dimmed by time. Yet when Bathsheba spoke, reminding him of the oath he had once made, that Solomon, the son of grace, the son of redemption, would reign after him, the old king stirred. When Nathan added his voice, sharp and urgent, David's spirit awakened as if pulled back from the edge of eternity. And the dying king rose to defend the future. He ordered that Solomon be proclaimed king immediately. No delay, no ceremony of comfort, no time for debate. Israel needed clarity, and the throne demanded a rightful heir before blood spilled into the streets. The palace exploded into sudden movement. Zadok the priest, Benaiah the commander, Nathan the prophet. They converged like three pillars holding up the nation's destiny. Solomon, likely stunned by the swiftness of events, was placed on King David's own mule, the unmistakable symbol of royal legitimacy. Surrounded by trumpets and crowds gathering like a rising tide, he was led toward Gihon, the place where heaven and earth would intersect in a moment of divine acceleration. Then it happened. A blast of the trumpet, a shout rising from thousands of voices, a roar that rolled like thunder along the valleys of Jerusalem. Long live King Solomon. It was not merely a coronation. It was the final strike that saved a kingdom from civil war. While Solomon was anointed with oil flowing from the horn of Zadok, while the people danced and cheered with a joy so fierce it shook the city, Adonijah's celebration collapsed. The sound of trumpets from Gihon pierced his banquet like a blade. His guests froze, his future shattered. For in that sound, he heard not just the rise of another king, but the end of his own dream. The crisis had been a breath away from bloodshed. David's intervention, swift, decisive, pulled the kingdom back from the edge of chaos. In the quiet that followed, Solomon stood at the threshold of destiny. The crown pressed lightly against his brow, but the weight of responsibility already bore down like a mountain. He had won the throne, but the throne would now test him. And as the cheers faded, another question rose in the air, unspoken but powerful. Would the boy who inherited the kingdom be strong enough to hold it? Now the true work begins, and in the next part, the young king must secure not only his crown, but the survival of the entire nation. Solomon's coronation may have silenced Adonijah's celebration, but it did not erase the danger. The morning after the trumpets faded, Jerusalem still carried the scent of tension, like smoke lingering long after a fire has been put out. The new king, barely more than a young man, now faced the most perilous task of any ruler, restoring unity in a kingdom that had just looked over the brink of civil war. In the dim corridors of the palace, courtiers whispered about Adonijah's allies, men of influence, men with power, men with grievances that could easily ignite a rebellion. Solomon understood something with chilling clarity. A throne is never secure while its enemies are still breathing. So the young monarch acted with a startling resolve. He summoned Adonijah first. The once ambitious prince fell at Solomon's feet, clinging to the horns of the altar, as though its sacred shape might protect him from justice. Solomon spared him, but not without a warning that cut like sharpened stone. If Adonijah remained honorable, he would live. But if corruption rose in him again, even the altar would not save him. The boy who had just worn the crown now wielded judgment like a blade. Next came Joab, the seasoned commander, with blood from past coups still dripping from his legacy. Joab fled to the sanctuary holding the altar as if it were a shield. But Solomon knew that justice cannot bend to the shadow of past privilege. Under Solomon's order, Joab's story ended, where he thought it would be preserved, reminding Israel that no one stands above the law of the king. Then Shimei, the man who once cursed David in the valley, was placed under strict watch in Jerusalem. Solomon's tone was gentle, but his boundaries were iron. When Shimei later broke the terms, Solomon executed him as well, establishing a message that rippled like shockwaves through the kingdom. Mercy exists, but rebellion dies. From an inexperienced youth, Solomon became the surgeon who cut away every fragment of instability. With the last embers of opposition extinguished, the kingdom entered a new phase. Solomon began to rebuild not just structures and councils, but the very rhythm of national life. He reorganized Israel's administrative districts, forming 12 regional units designed for more efficient governance. Tribute and taxes were systematized. Grain oil produced livestock, and metals now flowed into the royal storehouses with a precision the ancient world rarely achieved. Jerusalem transformed almost overnight into a capital humming with order and ambition. Solomon also understood the language of diplomacy. His marriage to the daughter of Pharaoh was far more than romance or spectacle. It was a declaration to the ancient world Israel now stood among the great powers. With that alliance came trade routes, ports, and access to Egyptian expertise, including scribes, architects, and military tactics. The young king was no longer reacting to danger. He was shaping the future with his own hands. The city swelled with foreign merchants who carried spices, linen, incense, jewels, papyrus, and exotic animals. Marketplaces buzzed in languages stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. Israel's borders strengthened. Its economy surged. Its influence radiated across continents like a rising constellation. Yet while the kingdom expanded, Solomon maintained a stillness inside himself, a contemplative quiet learned from watching his father pray at dawn. In private moments, he studied the Torah, recited psalms his father had written, and pondered the weight of ruling a chosen nation. Power did not seduce him then, it sobered him. Jerusalem, sensing the shift, moved from crisis to golden order. Even foreign emissaries acknowledged the transformation. They wrote home about a kingdom once fractured but now unified under a sovereign whose presence carried both gentleness and steel. The people trusted Solomon. They believed he would fulfill the promise given to David. They saw in him not just a ruler, but a bridge between the past and the destiny still unfolding. In those early years, it seemed impossible that such a disciplined mind, such a focused heart could one day drift into the shadows of his own decisions. But history often hides its deepest warnings inside the stories of its brightest heroes. And so the stage was set for the moment that would define everything. Before Solomon built a temple, conquered trade routes, or dazzled nations, heaven itself came searching for him. For in the quiet night of Gibeon, under the stars that had watched Abraham walk toward promise and Jacob wrestle with the unseen, a divine voice prepared to ask a question that would shape the course of human history. This is where the story turns. Solomon will meet the one who holds the wisdom of eternity in his whisper. Night fell over Gibeon like a veil drawn between two worlds. The air carried a strange stillness, the kind that presses gently against the heart, as if creation itself were holding its breath. Solomon had come here to offer sacrifices, to seek clarity, to steady his spirit after the turbulence of succession and the weight of new responsibility. Yet even he did not know that this night would become the most defining moment of his life. As the fires dimmed and silence gathered around him, Solomon lay down to rest alone, young and carrying a crown that felt far too heavy for human hands. Around him, the sacred high place seemed to tremble with memory. Abraham had walked these lands. Joshua had fought beneath these skies. Generations had cried out to God here, hoping for guidance. And now a new king waited in the dark, unaware that heaven was already drawing near. Then it happened. Not with thunder, not with fire, but with a presence that shattered the boundary between dream and reality. A voice, ancient, steady, luminous, filled the space around him. "Ask what I shall give you." The God of eternity placed all possibilities into the hands of a single man. Infinite power offering itself to a king barely grown. No conditions, no limitations. A question that could have rewritten history in any direction. Solomon could have asked for armies that would drown his enemies in dust. He could have demanded wealth heavy enough to tilt the scales of empires. He could have sought vengeance, security, immortality, or unchallenged power. But the young king's first words revealed the depth of his soul. He acknowledged his smallness. He remembered David's faithfulness. He confessed his inexperience. And then he asked the one thing no ruler before him had dared to ask: "Give your servant an understanding heart, to discern between good and evil." Solomon did not ask for treasures. He asked for truth. In that moment, the heavens responded like a storm of light. Because Solomon had not sought wealth, God promised him riches. Because he had not demanded power, God promised him honor. Because he had not asked for the death of his enemies, God granted him peace. And because he had asked for wisdom, God poured into him something beyond intellect, a divine capacity to see the world the way heaven sees it. He would be wise beyond kings, beyond sages, beyond the scholars of the ancient world. Israel would become a beacon among nations. Jerusalem would shine like a jewel on the map of history. But there was one condition woven into the promise, subtle, gentle, and easily overlooked: "If you walk in my ways." The gift, glorious as it was, carried a shadow, a possibility. A warning. The greatest wisdom ever given to a human being could still be undone by the simplest disobedience. Morning broke over Gibeon with a soft gold glow. When Solomon awoke, the dream had not faded. It clung to him like a mantle of fire and clarity. He knew something had changed inside him. His thoughts felt sharper, his awareness deeper. He moved with a quiet certainty, as though he could already hear the pulse of truth hidden beneath the noise of the world. Returning to Jerusalem, he stood before the Ark of the Covenant and offered sacrifices not out of fear or formality, but out of awe. He had encountered the living God in a dream, and the dream had reshaped reality. Soon the kingdom would witness what heaven had placed inside him. Soon decisions that once seemed impossible would unravel before him like tangled threads, falling effortlessly into order. Soon his name would travel across deserts, across seas, across kingdoms that had never before spoken Israel's tongue. But there was also a quieter truth, lingering in the air, one that only time would reveal. What happens when the wisest man on earth stops listening to the voice that made him wise? For now Israel rejoiced in the dawn of a golden age. For now Solomon stood at the beginning of a story radiant with promise. But destiny, like all things divine, carries both sunlight and shadow. And in the next part, the king's wisdom will be tested in a courtroom with no witnesses, and a truth so sharp it will split the nation's imagination in two. The early days of Solomon's reign unfolded like the slow rising of a sun no one had fully expected. Israel watched its young king with cautious hope, waiting to see whether the promise of wisdom given at Gibeon would manifest in the grit of real governance. And then came the case that would electrify a nation. It began with two women, ordinary, unnamed, living in the margins of society. They arrived at the royal court, carrying not wealth, influence, or prestige, but a single dispute wrapped in mystery and grief. Both claimed to be the mother of the same infant boy. Both wept. Both insisted the living child belonged to them. Both accused the other of treachery. There were no witnesses, no documents, no surviving husband or relative. Only two voices locked in a storm of desperation. It was a courtroom with no evidence, and a truth buried beneath agony. Historians later suggested that Solomon could have dismissed the case too messy, too emotional, too far beneath the dignity of a king. But he didn't. Something about the moment called him forward. It was as if heaven itself had brought him the perfect crucible to test the gift placed in his hands. The room fell silent as the women's cries echoed off stone walls, the kind of silence heavy enough to expose every heartbeat. Advisors shifted uneasily. Scriveners paused their writing. Even the guards trained to be statues seemed to brace themselves. Solomon listened. He watched their faces, their trembling hands, the way truth strained inside them like a caged bird. Then he stood from his throne. His voice, calm yet cutting, carried across the chamber. "Bring me a sword." Gasps rippled across the court. A weapon gleamed in the air, the metal catching the faint torchlight like a sliver of winter sun. And then came the command that froze time itself. "Divide the child in two. Give half to each woman." The command was never meant to kill the child. It was meant to resurrect the truth. The first woman embraced the verdict with chilling resignation. "Yes, let him be neither mine nor yours," she said. Her voice was brittle, hard-born from something darker than grief. But the second woman collapsed, clutching the floor, her cry breaking open like thunder. "No, my lord, give her the child, do not kill him." At that moment, every eye in the court turned to Solomon, waiting for the blade to fall or for judgment to be spoken. And the king, who had walked only a few steps from youth into power, now stepped fully into the majesty of his calling. "Give the child to the woman who begged for his life. She is the mother." Not applause, not cheers, but a deep, trembling recognition. Wisdom had appeared among them like a living flame. A false sword revealed the true heart. The infant was returned to his rightful mother. The other woman was dismissed, her scheme exposed, not by evidence, but by the divine instinct woven into the soul of a genuine parent. That day, news did not travel, it erupted. Merchants carried the story along trade routes. Shepherds whispered it in the hills. Priests recited it in the courts of the temple. Even foreign scribes recorded it with astonishment. marking the moment Israel's young king stepped into a brilliance no one had ever seen. In the palaces of Tyre, in the marketplaces of Egypt, in the caravans of Arabia, the story spread like wildfire. Israel has a king whose wisdom pierces the human heart. Solomon's reputation leapt beyond the borders of his kingdom. He became not just a ruler, but a symbol of justice, insight, and the strange, shimmering presence of the God who had spoken at Gibeon. But fame is a double-edged sword. It elevates, but it also invites the weight of greater expectation. It draws admiration and scrutiny. It opens doors and tests every step afterward. Israel rejoiced, but heaven watched. For this judgment was not the summit, it was the beginning. The world had seen the spark of Solomon's wisdom. Now it waited to see what he would build with it. That spark will ignite the most ambitious construction project in the ancient Near East. A temple meant to hold the glory of God itself. In the years following Solomon's rise, Jerusalem transformed from a rugged royal city into the beating heart of a growing empire. But among all the ambitions Solomon carried, one towered above the rest, an idea first planted in the longing of his father David, watered by prayer and now entrusted to the son who had inherited both the kingdom and the dream. A house for the name of the Lord, a sanctuary where heaven and earth would meet, a temple unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Solomon understood that such a vision could not be built with ordinary materials or ordinary minds, and so he reached across the sea to Tyre, where wisdom in craftsmanship rivaled Israel's wisdom in governance. Hiram, king of Tyre and friend of David, responded with enthusiasm. He offered cedar and juniper from the mountains of Lebanon, timber so fragrant and enduring that later empires would treasure even its memory. He sent stonemasons, bronze workers, carpenters, masters of their crafts whose skills whispered of ancient traditions older than any nation's borders. It was the first time in history two kingdoms united not for war, but to build a dwelling place for God. Lebanese cedar floated on rafts down the Mediterranean coast, then was hauled inland by teams of laborers whose chants echoed through valleys. Stone blocks, some weighing several tons, were quarried in silence, cut and shaped away from the construction site, so that no sound of iron tools would violate the sanctity of the rising house. Jerusalem became a symphony of labor, Israelites and Tyrians, architects and priests, overseers and apprentices, all moving with a shared purpose as though guided by a divine blueprint that pulsed from heaven itself. The structure that emerged was more than a building. It was a universe in miniature. The holy place glowed with golden lamps shaped like almond blossoms, symbolizing life. The inner sanctuary, the most holy place, stood cubed and perfect, a silent echo of eternity's geometry. Winged cherubim soared above the ark's future resting place, carved from olive wood, towering over the chamber as guardians of the unseen realm. Outside stood the two bronze pillars, Jachin and Boaz. Their names meant he establishes, and in him is strength. Together they framed the entrance like an invitation to step into the heartbeat of God himself. Every stone, every carving, every measure of gold declared a single truth. This was not a monument to Solomon. It was a throne room for the divine. 7 years of labor passed like the turning of a cosmic hourglass. When the final elements were set, when the gold gleamed like captured sunlight, when the sanctuary waited like a breath held too long, Solomon summoned the nation. Representatives from all tribes gathered, priests purified themselves, trumpeters, singers, Levites all arranged themselves as though preparing to welcome creation's first dawn. The Ark of the Covenant, long journeying with Israel from wilderness to promised land, was carried toward its resting place. Poles of acacia, curtains of linen, incense rising. As the priests stepped into the holy place, something shifted in the air, ancient, electric, alive. When the ark entered the most holy place, a cloud began to form, dense and radiant, filling the temple's inner courts. The priests staggered back, unable to stand beneath the weight of the presence that flooded the structure. When the ark was set down, the glory of heaven poured into the walls like liquid fire. The temple became a furnace of divine brilliance, not destroying, sanctifying, not consuming, announcing. A voice from eternity had come to dwell among mortals. The dream of generations had taken shape in stone and gold. Solomon lifted his hands and prayed a prayer that rippled through the centuries. He asked not just for God to dwell in the temple, but to hear the prayers of the broken, the exiled, the foreigner, the repentant. He asked for this house to become the meeting place where humanity would reach upward and where God would lean down in mercy. From that day forward, Jerusalem stood as the spiritual epicenter of the ancient world. Nations came not for trade or conquest, but for wonder. This was no ordinary sanctuary. It was the axis where the visible and invisible worlds touched. But even as the city shone with sacred beauty, the seeds of another story were already germinating quietly, subtly, in the shadows of Solomon's growing wealth, foreign alliances, and mounting ambitions. The temple was built, the glory had descended, and now the world would come to witness the golden age of Israel. Yet even gold, when stretched too thin, can tear. And in the next part, the kingdom will step into prosperity so dazzling. It will blind the king to dangers rising just beyond the horizon. The years after the dedication of the temple glowed with a brilliance that seemed almost unreal. Israel had stepped into something the ancient world had rarely seen, a kingdom at peace, a king renowned for wisdom, and a capital city becoming the envy of empires. It was as if the blessing of God had unfolded like a vast canopy over the land, stretching from the borders of Egypt to the distant deserts of Arabia. Jerusalem no longer looked like the city David conquered. It had become a glittering center of diplomacy and commerce. Caravans streamed in from Edom and Midian. Ships unloaded goods from Cyprus, Crete, Africa, and beyond. Records from the era suggest that Solomon's fleet operated jointly with the mariners of Tyre, sailed further than any Israelite vessel had ever dared to travel. Every 3 years, those ships returned from distant Ophir, their hulls heavy with treasures that dazzled the senses, gold so pure it reflected light like molten dawn sandalwood, as fragrant as the breath of Eden, exotic animals that stirred wonder in the royal courts. In Solomon's day, gold flowed into Jerusalem as if the rivers of the earth had forgotten their own courses. But wealth was only part of the transformation. Under Solomon's reign, art flourished like a second creation. Scribes recorded history with meticulous clarity. Musicians filled the courts with harmonies inspired by both shepherd songs and foreign rhythms. Scientists by ancient standards, studied plants, animals, seasons, and the natural order. Solomon himself wrote about trees from cedar to hyssop and cataloged creatures with the curiosity of a philosopher king. Architecture blossomed. Palaces gleamed with ivory inlays. Courtyards shimmered with polished stone. The hall of pillars rose like a forest turned to marble. And the king's own throne, decorated with lions of carved gold, became a symbol of judgment that echoed across continents. Yet the true moment when the world awakened to Solomon's greatness came from a queen who lived far beyond Israel's borders. Her name was Sheba, a ruler from the southern sands, from a kingdom rich in spice, incense, and myth. She heard stories whispered by merchants, diplomats, sailors, stories so extravagant she refused to believe them. So she prepared an expedition worthy of legend. Hundreds of attendants, camels carrying gold, gems, and spices so fragrant they perfumed the desert wind. Caravans crossing barren plains guided by starlight, driven by the queen's fierce desire to test the king's wisdom for herself. When she arrived in Jerusalem, the city erupted in astonishment. The Queen of Sheba entered the royal courts like a question wrapped in splendor. She examined everything. She probed Solomon with riddles. She questioned him about creation, justice, governance, faith, and the mysteries of the human heart. And Solomon answered her, each question, each challenge, each riddle, without hesitation, without faltering. His insight cut through complexities like a blade forged from eternity's edge. Then she saw the kingdom itself, the food on the king's table, the order of his officials, the garments of his servants, the ascent by which he went to the temple of the Lord. And the queen, overwhelmed by the vastness of it all, spoke the words that would echo through history. The report I heard in my own land was true, but even the half was not told to me. The rumors of Solomon's greatness were small compared to the reality. Her journey ended not just with admiration, but with revelation. For in Solomon she saw something the world rarely sees: power without chaos, wisdom without arrogance, wealth without collapse, at least in these early years. She returned home carrying not only gifts, but an encounter with a kingdom that seemed touched by the breath of heaven. Meanwhile, Solomon's literary brilliance exploded across the land. The Song of Songs poetry as intimate as breath, Proverbs wisdom distilled into gold-threaded sentences, Ecclesiastes a meditation on meaning that still unsettles modern minds. He became more than a king. He became a voice for humanity, a philosopher whose reflections traveled centuries like lanterns in the night. The golden age of Israel shone brighter with each passing year. Nations sought treaties, rulers sought advice. Trade routes shifted in Israel's favor because the world believed Solomon's touch turned dust to prosperity. And yet somewhere beneath the glitter of progress, beneath the songs and incense and diplomacy, the first cracks were forming. The golden age was glorious, but gold, when stretched too thin, begins to tear. Solomon stood at the height of his power, unaware of how close he was to the edge of an unseen descent. For soon wealth would demand more wealth, alliances would demand more alliances, and the heart that once sought wisdom above everything would be pulled toward shadows he never imagined he could enter. The brilliance of his reign begins to dim, not from enemies abroad, but from a slow unraveling within his own soul. For a time, the kingdom shimmered with the promise of eternity. The temple stood in radiant silence. The courts buzzed with abundance, and Solomon's wisdom flowed like an endless river. But cracks do not appear loudly. They begin as whispers, as hairline fractures beneath polished marble, as the soft shift of weight before a structure buckles. The first fracture began within the king himself. He loved many women, thousands, scripture says, gathered from kingdoms near and far. These marriages were not driven by affection alone. They were treaties forged in silk, agreements sealed in wedding feasts, alliances written in the language of intimacy and diplomacy. Egypt, Moab, Ammon, Sidon, Edom, Hittite lands, they all sent daughters to Solomon, each one a living contract. At first, it seemed harmless. The throne grew more secure, trade routes solidified, borders stabilized. But something far deeper was shifting, something Solomon may not have noticed until it was too late. 1,000 women meant 1,000 altars, and 1,000 competing loyalties. The foreign queens did not abandon their gods. They brought them to Jerusalem. Small idols carved from stone and metal, rituals, sacred objects, songs sung in languages Solomon knew only from trade agreements. With time, these women built shrines on the hills rising opposite the temple, the very hills Solomon's own father had once crossed in worship. Chemosh, Molech, Ashtoreth, names that carried violence, desire, and darkness, names that Israel had been commanded not to utter. The king, who had dedicated a house to the living God, now walked among altars dedicated to gods he knew were empty. Smoke rose from sacrifices not offered to the Lord, but to spirits of foreign lands. And with every new shrine, a piece of the kingdom's soul dimmed. The king, who once dazzled the nations with wisdom, now stumbled toward the gods they served. But the unraveling did not stop at the spiritual level. Prosperity had a price. Grand palaces required labor. Military expansion demanded resources. Trade networks required maintenance. Fortified cities needed builders. The common people of Israel, especially in the northern tribes, felt the strain first. Taxes grew heavier. Workloads increased. Fields that once fed families now fed the empire. What had once been voluntary national pride began to feel like royal compulsion. Whispers turned into grumbling. Grumbling into resentment. Resentment into fear. Jerusalem gleamed, but rural villages felt hollowed. The north began to murmur that David had been a shepherd king, but Solomon had become a king of stone and gold. Prosperity at the top was becoming pressure at the bottom, and as internal tensions rose, external enemies sensed opportunity. Hadad the Edomite returned from exile, fueled by generational vengeance. Rezon of Damascus carved out a kingdom and became a thorn in Israel's side. Old wounds reopened, and new threats emerged like wolves circling the fold. But the most dangerous enemy was not foreign, it was homegrown. Jeroboam, a hard-working overseer from Ephraim, sharp-minded, charismatic, respected by the people. Solomon noticed him and promoted him, perhaps believing the man's loyalty was secure. But Jeroboam saw what others only whispered: the nation was dividing inside itself. And before long, a prophet named Ahijah met Jeroboam on a lonely road and tore a cloak into 12 pieces, 10 for Jeroboam, 2 for the house of David. A kingdom not yet broken already had a successor waiting in the shadows. When Solomon heard of the prophecy, fear ignited in him. The man who once judged with divine insight now hunted Jeroboam, who fled to Egypt, the same empire Solomon once tamed through alliance. Meanwhile, the king's heart drifted further from the God who had given him everything. His prayers grew quieter, his decisions grew harsher, his clarity dimmed beneath the smoke of foreign altars and the weight of endless ambition. The downfall had not yet come, but the direction was set. And in the courts of heaven, the God who had appeared to Solomon twice now prepared to withdraw a measure of favor. He had once poured out so freely. Empires rarely collapse from foreign swords. They collapse from fractures in the soul of the one who built them. Solomon still sat on the throne. The temple still shone. The empire still stretched wide. But beneath it all, the tremors grew stronger, silent warnings that a day of reckoning was drawing near. And in the next part, we will witness the end of Solomon's reign and the moment when the Golden Kingdom finally splinters into two. Solomon reigned 40 years, 4 decades that rose like a sunrise and ended like a fading ember. When he died, the news spread through Jerusalem in a hush that felt almost unreal. The man who had built the temple, who had dazzled the nations, who had ruled an empire of gold and wisdom, now lay still. No thunder rolled, no fire fell, only silence. The kind of silence that arrives when a giant finally falls. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, inherited the throne, but he did not inherit his father's wisdom. He stood before the assembly at Shechem, a young man filled with bravado and insecurity. The northern tribes approached him with a plea that had been simmering for years. Lighten the burdens your father placed upon us, ease the labor, the taxes, the heavy yoke. For a moment, hope flickered. Rehoboam consulted the elders who had walked with Solomon, men who carried the memory of better days. They urged gentleness. They advised compassion. They reminded him that a king who serves his people becomes a king whose people will serve him for life. But their words fell like seeds on stony ground. Rehoboam turned to the younger advisors, men who mistook arrogance for strength and cruelty for leadership. They whispered that softness was weakness, that concessions were defeat, that respect must be demanded, and fear must be cultivated. And so, in the most catastrophic announcement a king of Israel would ever make, Rehoboam spoke the line that carved itself into the bones of history. My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. And then even harsher, my father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. With one sentence, he shattered the unity it took Solomon a lifetime to build. The northern tribes erupted. Their anger turned to rebellion and rebellion to secession. 10 tribes broke away, choosing Jeroboam, the former overseer, the man once pursued by Solomon as their king. Only Judah and Benjamin remained with the house of David. In a single day, the kingdom split like a tree struck by lightning. Israel in the north, Judah in the south, 2 nations where there had once been one. The temple still stood in Jerusalem, its gold shining in the sun, but the soul of the nation dimmed. The unity that had once made Israel a beacon among empires dissolved into rivalry, suspicion, and spiritual decline. And in the dust of this great fracture, the shadow of Solomon lingered. Solomon built an empire, but he also planted the seeds of a division that would haunt his people for centuries. History is never kind to leaders who begin in light and end in shadow. Solomon's legacy was a double-edged sword. On one edge, the peak of Israel's culture, wisdom, and architecture, a temple unmatched in splendor, literature that still shapes human thought, Proverbs, Song of Songs, the piercing reflections of Ecclesiastes, a kingdom at peace admired by rulers across continents. On the other edge, excessive taxes, labor burdens that crushed the north, 1,000 political marriages that weakened devotion, altars to foreign gods polluting the hills across from the temple, and a nation so strained by luxury and compromise that it split at the first provocation. Solomon was both the architect of Israel's greatest glory and the precursor of its deepest wound. As the years passed, prophets would look back at his reign with mixed voices, some honoring the achievements, others warning of the dangers hidden inside unchecked prosperity and divided loyalty. And then comes the question that has whispered through centuries, haunting scholars, theologians, and believers alike. Did Solomon repent? Did he, in his final days, turn his heart back to the God who had met him at Gibeon? Is the book of Ecclesiastes truly the sorrowing confession of a king who found the world empty without God? Or is it the hollow echo of a man who had glimpsed heaven, then wandered too far into the shadows to find his way home? The Bible does not tell us. The silence is deliberate, an invitation for every reader to wrestle with the same truth. Solomon faced brilliance cannot save a divided heart. And so the story of Solomon ends not with answers, but with a mirror held up to every life that has tasted both wisdom and weakness, both devotion and distraction. The golden age has passed. The temple stands. The nation is split. The legacy is complicated. The questions remain. But before we close, stay with me, because the story of Solomon holds a final reflection meant especially for those who have lived long enough to see both rise and fall, gain and loss, hope and regret. What comes next is a message for hearts seasoned by years, a quiet truth meant to honor the journey you have walked, and it begins right after this moment. And so, as the dust settles on Solomon's story, we are left with more than history. We are left with a mirror, a reminder that brilliance does not erase our fragility, and that even the wisest among us can wander if the heart grows tired of listening. But there is a truth here worth holding close, especially for those who have traveled many seasons of life. A life is not measured by its moments of perfection, but by its willingness to return. Return to faith, return to clarity, return to the quiet place where God still whispers. Solomon's rise shows us the beauty of a life rooted in purpose. His fall warns us of the cost of slow compromises, and his unanswered ending invites us into something rare, hope that it is never too late to turn back, to realign, to rebuild what time has worn down. For those who have carried burdens, survived losses, or wondered if their best days are behind them, here this legacy is not only what you leave in stone, but what you leave in hearts. Wisdom shared, compassion given, faith lived quietly but faithfully. The story of Solomon does not end in despair. It ends with a door still open. And perhaps that door is open for you too. Solomon's journey has carried us from brilliance to brokenness, from a temple filled with glory to a kingdom split by its own weight. His life reminds us that greatness and fragility walk side by side, and that every heart, no matter how wise, stands at the crossroads of choosing light or losing it. As we close this chapter, let the echoes of his story linger, not as a warning alone, but as an invitation to reflect on our own paths, our own choices, our own legacy. His life may be complete, but yours is still unfolding, one decision, one prayer, one quiet act of faith at a time. If this journey stirred something within you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Like the video, share it with someone who might need its message, and subscribe to continue exploring the hidden depths of Scripture with us. Stay with the channel and let your voice become part of this growing circle of seekers. And now, as we turn the page, remember, every ending in the Bible points toward another mystery waiting in the wings. Let's meet there in the next story.